Hi, and welcome to the third season of the WholisticMatters podcast series titled The Holistic Approach to Pet Care. My name's Kara Cradle, and I'll be facilitating your audio journey into the world of nutritional support for pets, the importance of the endocannabinoid system for animals, and the unique components of the veterinary profession. I'm here with Jody Griffiths, who's been a certified veterinary technician for over 20 years. Today, we're talking about hemp and the endocannabinoid system with integrative biologist Slavko Komarnytsky. Let's get started. Before we jump into the interview, I thought it might be helpful to go over some of the jargon we'll use in this conversation. The first being ECS, an acronym for endocannabinoid system.
Yes, there's also CBD for cannabidiol and tetrahydrocannabinol for THC.
I can definitely see why we need an acronym for that last one. We'll also talk about cannabinoid receptors, and we usually refer to two of them, Cb1 and Cb2. And if we think of any other acronyms along the way, we'll be sure to call them out. All right, let's start off with a question people are always asking. Hemp and marijuana, different in some ways and similar in other ways. How are they used differently?
Right, and I think Dr. Komarnytsky describes it perfectly when he talks about how when you think of hemp and marijuana stemming from cannabis, these two things started out essentially the same. So let's take a listen to how exactly he describes it.
So, I'll just say Komarnytsky is a mouthful. So for the purposes of this podcast, he did say we could refer to him by his first name of Slavko.
If you're talking from the botanical perspective, right, it's exactly the same plant. So you isolate the DNA from a plant, you look at it, whether it's hemp and marijuana, it's exactly the same, right? So in nature, there was one plant. Humans found it by choice or by accident, right? And then because the plant is so versatile, they actually design many different ways that they can apply the plant into their life and into the life of their animals, right? So basically, the plant is quite robust. It grows everywhere. It doesn't need particular soils. It doesn't need particular climates. As long as it has enough daylight time, it will grow and flourish, right? It has very rigid structure, so it has a lot of fiber inside the plant. So one group of people decided to select the plants which have longer fibers, stronger fibers, and eventually they develop what we call hemp varieties, right? So these are the varieties which have high fiber content, they have high oil content, they can be used as foods, they can be used in textile industries, they're excellent for making ropes, many other things, but obviously what people didn't want in that plant is the other compounds which are psychoactive.
And just to clarify, I'll add that marijuana is defined as all parts of the cannabis plant, with the relevant exception being the stalk and the seeds, which are separately defined as hemp, as long as those parts contain less than 0.3% THC. While state laws are rapidly evolving in the direction of legal marijuana, federal law and many state laws still say marijuana is illegal. A product derived from hemp, again, that's the stalk and seeds of the cannabis plant, is not marijuana.
That's right. And as Slavko points out, cannabis has always been easy to grow and integrate into various products. I think that's what he says next about the historical uses of marijuana is really interesting.
At the same time, marijuana is recognized for its first and the most psychoactive properties, and particular, it's either medicinal or recreational, or if you look at the history of human beings, it's religious use, right? So the plant was associated with our well-being and our emotional, our psychological well-being or changes in our mood and our system, right? So because of this intrinsic difference, right, if you talk to a scientist, basically you'll get an answer. Marijuana and hemp are exactly the same thing, just bred for two different purposes. If you talk to a regular person, they say, well, they're two different things. They're like on the opposite sides of the spectrum.
So it really depends on who you ask. So interesting.
Yes, and what I think Slavko talked about next is super important. He describes plants like cannabis as small biochemistry factories. And although every single part of the hemp plant is producing phytochemicals like CBD, different plant tissues are going to produce different amounts of CBD. Let's take a listen.
So flowers and the small leaves which surround the florets of this plant, they have the highest level of CBD. And then a little bit less amounts of CBD can be found in leaves and stalks of the plant. And then the root tissues, which are underground, they contain trace amounts of CBD, which is probably, if I had to guess, 20 to 30 times less than the area of the upper, above the ground parts of the plant.
Next, we asked Slavko about the difference between CBD and THC. He said that they are both phytocannabinoids, with chemical differences between them that are small but significant in the way that THC is associated with psychoactive properties and CBD is not.
Right. And before we listen to Slavko's response, can we talk for a minute about the word phytocannabinoids? Breaking it down, it basically means plant compounds that influence the endocannabinoid system. There also are endocannabinoids, which are produced internally by any organism that has an endocannabinoid system.
And that includes humans, dogs, cats, and so many more.
Right. Now let's hear how Slavko describes the differences between CBD and THC.
Right. So, I mean, both THC and CBD are cannabinoids, right? So these are compounds which belong to exactly the same class of phytoactives. And the difference is negligible for the most part. You know, it's a single chemical bond that's getting broken, and then THC is being converted to CBD, basically. But that chemical bond is very critical for its psychoactive activity, right? Because it allows the compound to bond and interact with very high affinity to Cb1 and Cb2 receptors, right? So THC, psychoactive, direct binding, very high affinities. CBD, the bond is not there, so there is no direct interaction with the Cb1 and Cb2 receptor, but there is like a secondary indirect way that Cb2 receptors interact with CBD molecules and cause a completely different set of responses, right? With that in mind, you have to think of THC as the potent molecule which affects your psychological state, right? And CBD as a less potent analog of THC, right? Because it doesn't interact directly with the cannabinoid receptors, it doesn't have the same, psychological high associated with its use, right? But at the same time, it still stimulates the endocannabinoid system in our bodies to produce other beneficial effects of cannabinoids.
So people grew cannabis plants for different reasons, picking and choosing different types of the plant based on qualities that they like or dislike. Sturdy leaves, tall stems. Does this sound familiar to you?
I think I see where you're going with this.
It's just like how people have bred dogs for thousands of years. There's a 2016 New York Times article, and we'll post that link on our podcast page. But this article reports research showing that dogs were domesticated as long as 15,000 years ago. Just like people grow different strains of cannabis for different reasons, people breed different types of dogs for different reasons. Big and small, long hair and short hair, hunters and protectors.
So true, and it's so interesting how people did this with dogs and with cannabis before they even understood the science or the genetics of it all. We talked about this with Slavko, and he agreed that the metaphor checks out.
It's very similar, and it exactly highlights the fact that evolution, right, of a living being is completely random, right? So the mutations which happen in our genomes, which happen in the genomes of the animals or plants, they're random, right? They're responsible for different features, and it's up to the human being to decide which features are necessary once the animal or the plant is domesticated. So in one village, people think the fiber is important, so they grow hemp. In another village, people think the spiritual thing is important, they grow marijuana. The same way people breed dog to, take care of the animals, to take care of the babies.
This dog runs really fast, so I'm going to breed more of this dog, or...
Exactly that, right? So, and humans who domesticated dogs and humans who domesticated cannabis were the same people. Right?
And they just didn't realize quite what they were doing at the time.
Right.
No, like as any human being, you want something better for yourself, right? So when you're presented with 3 dogs and one of them is stronger and you need a defense, you select that puppy over the other 2.
Right.
are growing cannabis and using it in all these different ways, at what point do you think people started to realize the existence of what could eventually be called the endocannabinoid system in the human body?
I mean, we knew the plant and we knew the compounds, and we still had no idea how and what they do to our bodies or to the bodies of our animals, right? And only through basically very consistent research in 60s and early 70s, it probably took about 20 to 25 years until we figured out the first receptor, the Cb1 receptor. I believe it was described in 1985 or something like this, that led to the discovery of entire new physiological system in our bodies, right? Because when we discovered Cb1, we basically discovered the first break, the first door to an entirely new system that we never even knew that existed, yet everybody has it. We have it, cat has it, dog has it, worm has it, insect has it, right? Cannabinoid system is very old. Endocannabinoids are present in pretty much most of the animals, right? And the system as it is now existed for at least 300 million years. And it's only in the last 30 years that we discovered it.
Let's talk about cannabinoids. How did people first discover that it was partially the cannabinoids in plants like cannabis that were responsible for the effects cannabis products have on the human body?
In the late 50s and early 60s, right, because cannabis in general received a very bad stigma, right, for being abused in certain situations. In many countries of the world, it was prohibited to put federal money to fund cannabis-based research, right? And one of the very few exceptions was a little country called Israel, where it was allowed. I don't remember whether it was ubiquitous, means that any lab could do it, or there are only certain labs and certain institutions which received the permits to work with cannabis, right? Mm-hmm. And they were the first research groups who isolated and identified cannabinoids, right? So THC and CBD, the bioactive principles in cannabis plant.
THC is a cannabinoid and CBD is a cannabinoid. How do different cannabinoids have different effects on the body?
So you have to remember a few things, right? The endocannabinoid system itself has 3 major levels, right? And at each of these levels, the system is regulated. And at each of these levels, the system can be different from person to person or from animal to animal, okay? So the first and very primary level is the cannabinoid receptors, right? So every human being or every animal, for what we know, has at least 2 cannabinoid receptors, right, which are called Cb1 and Cb2, to make it very convenient for the scientists to talk about, I guess. And both THC interacts directly with the cannabinoid receptors. CBD interacts indirectly, right? But they target those receptors, right? This is the opening door for the endocannabinoid system. That's where the signal is perceived and be transduced into our bodies, right? At the same time, we don't want to perceive the signal all the time. So there is a second way of endogenous enzymes, right, which basically shred, I guess, the message which is translated by the cannabinoid receptors and stop it from happening, right? So the activity of these enzymes is different depending on the part of the body where it's coming from, depending on the tissue, depending on the age. So you already see the intrinsic complexity of the system, right? Where you can have different amount of Cb1 versus Cb2 receptor. You can have different levels of enzyme activity, right? And you, in addition to all this, right, you produce the endogenous cannabinoids. Your bodies produce molecules which which are designed to interact with Cb1 and Cb2 receptors. Mm-hmm. And the cannabis plants, just by accident, hijack those systems, right? Mm-hmm. Because our receptors were not designed to interact with the phytoactive principles of a cannabis plant. It just by chance, it happened that these molecules fit into the same chemical space, right, of our endogenous receptors, right? So our bodies make our own endocannabinoids, and they're responsible for myriad of different things. But if you want to think it in a simple way, it's a homeostasis system, right? It's a system that tries to keep everything else in our bodies in check.
So just to recap, there are different tiers of the endocannabinoid system: cannabinoids, cannabinoid receptors, and endogenous enzymes. Cannabinoids, whether internally produced or found in the environment.
Like phytocannabinoids from cannabis.
Right, and these cannabinoids interact with cannabinoid receptors. And endogenous enzymes, endogenous again meaning something that's produced internally by the body's own natural mechanisms, these endogenous enzymes modify the activity of cannabinoids and cannabinoid receptors.
Right. And the tiers of the endocannabinoid system change from person to person. So my endogenous enzymes will act differently from yours, and we may have different levels of cannabinoid receptors.
Yep. And even within one individual's ECS, cannabinoid receptors and endogenous enzyme levels and concentrations change based on where they are found in the body.
Got it. So when Slavko says that the ECS is a homeostasis system, what exactly does he mean by that?
Essentially, the ECS, as a homeostasis system, helps keep the body in balance. Balance is the key word here. So how does the THC, CBD amount differ in marijuana versus hemp?
All right, so if you compare the two varieties, right, if you compare the medicinal or recreational marijuana to the hemp plant, the most obvious difference is that marijuana plants were selected by humans to contain very high amounts of THC, right? And it's an ongoing selection, right? We didn't stop doing it. So every year or every couple of years, the new strains are being generated which have higher and higher amount THC, right? So the recreational marijuana, which was famous in the 70s, is nothing like recreational marijuana, which is today, right? The amounts of THC probably doubled or tripled since that time, just because of the active selection by humans. At the same time, hemp, because it was selected exactly for the opposite properties, right, for not to contain THC, has very, very little THC in it, right? The numbers differ depending on which strain you're talking about, right? So it's very convenient to use a general statement that there is a federal regulation, right, which specifically defines what's marijuana and what's hemp.
And that's what you mentioned earlier about hemp having less than 0.3% THC, right?
Correct.
Right, but then within those two broad categories, right, you will have a lot of different strains with different, slightly different ratios, right? So it will be above or below 0.3%, but then you can have 0.6, 0.9, 20. So that's what defines the strength and potency of every single strain.
Interesting. So there is definitely differences in THC and CBD content among strains of marijuana and strains of hemp. Let's hear a bit more about the significance of understanding the ratio of THC to CBD in cannabis products.
Right. It's the ratio is very important, and it's important to the point that every single manufacturer of the hemp product should be really aware, right, what their product is containing. It's relatively easy to take marijuana, to take hemp plants and extract CBD containing oil from different parts of the plant, whether it's stems, whether it's leaves, whether it's flowers, right? Put it in a bottle and put it on the market. Right. It's extremely easy. Pretty much anybody can do it once they have the proper permits in place, right? What's very difficult is to ensure the consistency of your product, right? Because slight changes in amount of CBD versus other cannabinoids often translate to quite significant changes in the physiological outcome of the person or animal who are taking them, right? And plants are plants. They're chemical factories. They don't care about us. If the growing conditions are different from year to year, to season, if the storing conditions are different, if the shipping conditions are different, the amounts of the biochemicals in those products change, right? So in order to be consistent, in order to make sure that you deliver to our subject, to the animal, the same amount of the bioactive principle, you have to do the testing. Right. You have to know exactly the levels of THC, you have to know exactly the levels of CBD, and if you can, also the levels of other cannabinoids and terpenes, which are present in cannabis plant.
Yes, I'm so excited to talk about terpenes. The spotlight has been so much on THC and CBD, but terpenes are also an important part of the equation.
It's funny because if I tell you what terpenes are, you'll tell, oh, of course I know them. I experience them every day, right? Because terpenes are hydrocarbons, so they're quite lipophilic. They're soluble in organic solvents, molecules, which are produced by many, many different plants, right? Mm-hmm. And you have a huge spectrum of terpenes. And the way that we are familiar with interacting with terpene is by smelling and tasting them, right? So if you look or you can try to remember all the major smells and taste of many different botanical products, whether they are foods, spices, supplements, right? Mm-hmm. Any kind of balmy, lemony, citrony, earthy, woody smells, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And all the perceptions which come together with them are generated by terpenes present in those products, mm-hmm. right? We as humans have a very interesting relationship with terpenes, and we like them so much that we even developed the entire perfume industry mm-hmm. based on them, right? Because we like to smell good, or we like to feel good, and terpenes, they invoke those emotions in us, depending on which terpene it is, yeah. right? So now you have to realize that hemp, as many other plants, has a different variety of terpenes. And different strains, different varieties, different cultivars, mm-hmm. or even the same plant growing in two different conditions, mm-hmm. have a unique terpene profile, right? It's a mixture of 10 to 20 major terpenes that plant is producing, right? Depending on what the profile is, your perception of the plant changes, right? There are some terpene combinations which, give you the boost. It's kind of like, I feel good, by smelling it or by tasting it. Right. Sometimes it's more calming down kind of emotions, mm-hmm. right, which are associated with certain flavors and smells, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And now transpose that onto your response from cannabinoids, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. So basically terpenes is like little secondary players. They don't do much by themselves, mm-hmm. right? But in combination with cannabinoids right. present in a plant, mm-hmm. right, they create this secondary level of pull and push mechanism, mm-hmm. which allow you to define a hemp product with a particular property.
Interesting. What did you mean when he says lipophilic?
Lipophilic is a chemistry term that essentially means terpenes are compatible with dissolving in lipids, often what people call fats. And I think it's really interesting how that while many people may not be familiar with the word terpenes, they experience them on a regular basis in the form of smells, the feel-good boost he describes, and calming emotions.
So the issue with extracting CBD from hemp as a solution, while terpenes may not do the job all on their own, it seems that they play a critical role in elucidating various beneficial effects that people tend to associate with hemp and CBD.
The best approach to find a dietary supplementation or any kind of intervention for the human being, right, is to try different things, right? And the terpenes add that level of complexity to the system, right? CBD will be more or less the same, right, when you put it in a bottle. If you isolate full spectrum hemp products, right, so the CBD is there, but on top of that, it contains the complexity of other molecules, right. other cannabinoids and terpenes present in the plant, mm-hmm. right? Suddenly, you can have different products based on CBD which suit different personalities, right? Mm-hmm. Different conditions, mm-hmm. different supplementation needs, mm-hmm. right? And then you can mix and match, right? You can realize that my animal or myself need different type of supplementation, and you can, within obviously certain means, design a specific supplementation route or product which fits you better.
And this fits in really well with our philosophy at Holistic Matters. Whether we're talking about whole foods or the ECS, a holistic approach that includes all of the original natural components of a particular plant is key.
Your bodies are very smart. I mean, forget about your brains. I mean, your brains are smart too, right? But your body itself is designed, to deal with bioactive principles, right? Whether they are nutrients, whether they are minerals, whether they are vitamins. And your body knows what's missing most of the time, right? So if you give a variety of things to your body, it's capable of picking and choosing what it needs when it is presented, right? Only in certain conditions, we talk about severe diseases, like, for example, Crohn's, when your digestive system is compromised to the point that it cannot really absorb a lot of nutrients efficiently, then you can say, okay, direct supplementation of a very specific thing will help because otherwise the digestive system cannot deal with it, right? But if you're trying to supplement, if you're trying to alleviate certain states, or basically provide support to your body, give the variety. Give variety to your body and let it choose what it needs.
Now let's add more layers to this sandwich. What about omega-3 fatty acids? What role do they play in the ECS?
In our bodies, right, the fatty acids, whether they are omega-3, omega-6, and cannabinoids, share the same pathways, right? So it all starts with the simple fatty acids that we either make in our bodies, or if we can't, in case of omega-3s, right, we have to take them with food. But after that, it's pretty much the same thing, right? We keep modifying the molecule and go through the series of omega-6 fatty acids until one of the final product is, no surprise, endocannabinoids, right? And at the same time, you have the omega-3, which is bent a little in a different way until you end up with having two related molecules, which are abbreviated as EPA and DHA, and these are two most famous omega-3 acids in our diet, right? So both of the fatty acids, right, whether they are cannabinoids because these are fatty acid derivatives, or the omega-3s, omega-6s, they have the capacity to interact with cannabinoid receptors, with cannabinoid enzymes, and with prostaglandin biosynthesis, or molecules and enzymes which are responsible for prostaglandin biosynthesis, which in turn regulates the immune system in our bodies, right? So you see how the complexity comes all together, right? So depending on which composition you have in your body versus which composition you have in your diet, with the ratios of omega-6s to omega-3s and your endogenous level of cannabinoids, you have a complex system which regulates a lot of things, right? But for the simple part, let's focus on the immune system.
There's a lot more we could talk about when it comes to omega-3 fatty acids, and there's a lot of great education on this subject on WholisticMatters.com. So if you're listening to this podcast and want to learn more about omega-3 fatty acids, go check out WholisticMatters.com. We have a spotlight page on omega-3 fatty acids, and you can find that under the Discover tab.
That's great. So next we asked Slavko about the ECS and the effects on immunity. And the answer largely has to do with Cb1 and Cb2 cannabinoid receptors, and how you can find different concentrations of these receptors at specific places in the body. Let's take a listen.
Basically, the difference of the effects of endocannabinoids or cannabinoids present in cannabis plant on the immune system depends on the presence of Cb1 and Cb2 receptors, right? Our body has them in every single cell, but in different amounts, right? So Cb1s are mostly restricted to what's called central nervous system, CNS, right? So our brain stem, but mostly restricted, which means it's also present in other parts in the body, but in a smaller amounts, right? Cb2 is exactly the opposite. They are mostly located in our gut and on most of our immune cells, right? But they are hardly present in the CNS except for certain very specific areas, right? CBD, right, which is a cannabinoid which is mostly responsible for the immune-related effects of the cannabis plant, right, interacts indirectly with Cb2 receptors, right? So because of that specificity, high CBD containing products have the properties of keeping the inflammation in check, right? So basically they suppress the activity of CB2 receptors and in that way suppress the activity of our immune systems, right? Omega-6s do exactly the opposite, right? They activate, they stimulate our immune systems, they help us launch immune responses. They are very good in defense mechanism, right? But once that reaction is not in check, once our body loses the capacity to actually control it, right, the inflammation keeps going and going and going, right? If you look at the last 15 years, inflammation was stigmatized, right? Say, it's bad for you, it's bad for you, it's bad for you. It's a natural defense. It's very good for you because it fights off all the viruses, all the bacteria, it fights off tons of other diseases, right? The bad thing about it, if your body cannot control it, right? So it keeps going, it perpetuates itself for a very, very long time, right? That's when it's damaging, right? And CB2 receptor is one of the brake mechanisms that allows it to stop. And by chance, by accident, but CBD molecules interact with those receptors and they can actually help to lower down the activity of our immune system.
Here's a big one. What is the role of the ECS in the human body?
It's a maintenance. You know, there's the janitors of our bodies, so to speak. You don't see them, but they're a very critical part, right? They make sure that everything else is in check. Whenever something goes up, it brings it down. When something goes down, it brings it up, right? They control our metabolism, our immune system, our emotional well-being, and many, many other things, right? By basically putting a very effective brakes, right, on the signaling which happens in our bodies. Whenever anything that goes over the limit, it cuts it, right? It basically says, stay within the borders, whatever that is, right? And this is what allows us to function as the human beings and not to be overloaded by certain things, right? Whether these are the metabolic responses, whether these are the emotional responses. It keeps us in check and basically tells us, relax, there is a way to deal with it, and then your body deals with it, right? Yeah. In a way. So think about it, about the fancy scientific word, right? The homeostasis, right? The maintenance system, which basically cleans it up and trims everything which is not necessary, right? While it's functional, you don't know it's there, right? Because you think it's a norm. You think I get excited and then I cool down and I'm fine. Or, I get really sad and then a couple of minutes later I recover and I move on, right? That's your endocannabinoid system working efficiently behind the scenes, right? Yeah. Trimming the excitation, upregulating when things are not where they're supposed to be. And only when that system starts to break, you start seeing other things happening.
I like the metaphor that he uses of janitors of our bodies. So switching gears a bit, I've heard a lot that hemp cannot be organic. And so we asked Slavko, is that true?
It is true that hemp uptakes a lot of nutrients from the soils, right? But it's also true for many other crops that we are growing, right? So a smart farmer, an educated farmer, knows that, right? And specifically designs crop rotations and seeding strategies to compensate for it, right? Yeah, obviously, you can always supplement your field with minerals and things and compensate for it that way, right? But you can also mitigate a lot of bad influences by developing a sequence of crop which utilizes different minerals present in soil, right? You can also use crops which accumulate certain minerals in their leaves, and then you can basically return it back to the soil, by collecting the crop and basically mowing over, right? So, on one way, it is true, right? Hemp is a weed in many ways, right? It's a plant which grows anywhere specifically because of this property, because it's very efficient as getting the nutrients that it needs, right? But you can manage it. And you can manage with different crop, with different rotation cycles to make sure that you don't deplete your soil.
And finally, the last question that we asked Slavko is, do you have any pets of your own?
I used to have a cat for quite a long time, 10 years. Was the love of my life. I mean, he passed away, unfortunately. I have fish now. My daughter loves fish, right? So we have two aquarium tanks going on with different fishes swimming around. So that counts as pet, right?
Yes. And fish have endocannabinoid systems as well.
They do. They do. Every single animal that you can find on this earth, I mean, other than some primitive, single cell organism, they do have a rudimentary, but they have the endocannabinoid system. It's so important, right? Because it maintains our bodies, that it was designed, well, whether you want to argue whether it was a conscious design or unconscious design, from evolutionary point of view, it evolved way before many other things evolved, right? And it keeps our bodies in check 300 million years ago, and today exactly the same way.
What an awesome interview we had with Slavko. The science of the endocannabinoid system is so complex, and we're still learning a lot about how phytocannabinoids from plants and endocannabinoids from our own bodies interact with the cannabinoid receptors and other components of the endocannabinoid system to influence all kinds of physiological activity. For more on hemp and the endocannabinoid system, be sure to check out the link to the Holistic Matters Hub on the podcast page for this episode. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll introduce veterinarian Dr. Sheila Dodson, who's also very knowledgeable at hemp and the endocannabinoid system, but especially when it comes to pets. Stay tuned for more. So Slavko is definitely so knowledgeable about cannabis, hemp, and the endocannabinoid system, and I'm so glad he was able to join us for the first part of this episode and share all that he did about the science of the ECS, including cannabinoids, cannabinoid receptors, endogenous enzymes, and all of that. We also got to sit down with Dr. Sheila Dodson, who's been a veterinarian for over 2 decades. Jody, would you take a minute and introduce Dr. Dodson for our listeners?
I would be honored to. Dr. Dodson received her DVM from Kansas State University in 1999. She's the owner of Mariposa Veterinary Wellness Center, and that's located in Lenexa, Kansas. Her vision for animals and their people at Mariposa is to provide the best in integrated medicine with an emphasis on wellness care. I've had the pleasure of working with her in multiple ways. She is one of the most down-to-earth caring vets I know, and her knowledge and experience is absolutely incredible.
That's really great. Needless to say, Dr. Dodson also knows a lot about the ECS, especially when it comes to talking about the ECS outside of the context of humans.
Yes, and that's, of course, the first question that we asked her. How is the ECS different in animals and humans? And how is it the same?
Well, we do know that all mammals, humans, fish, reptiles, amphibians do have an endocannabinoid system. So the system is throughout the entire body. So there's not sufficient research to really know exactly all the receptors that there are in the body. So there are 2 that we know of. And so animals and humans share that entire network, that system. But we currently don't have good information as far as where the vast majority of those receptors are. We do know they're everywhere, affecting every system. One of the differences we do know is that dogs do have more Cb1 receptors in their brain than people do. There are 2 receptors in the endocannabinoid system that we've identified, Cb1 and Cb2, and having a higher Cb1 receptor in the brain for dogs is the receptor that the psychoactive ingredient, for instance, in marijuana, THC, has a higher affinity for those Cb1 receptors. And so it makes us have to be aware that because dogs have more receptors for that in their brain, they are more susceptible to some of the toxic effects of ingesting something like marijuana that has high THC.
So it sounds like there's still a lot of research to be done on this subject, but it's likely that for the organisms that do have an endocannabinoid system, and there's a lot, they also have at least a similar structure of cannabinoids, cannabinoid receptors, and endogenous enzymes that interact in different ways to influence physiological processes.
And I can only imagine all of the unique differences that are probably evident in the endocannabinoid systems of different organisms. Like how Dr. Dodson explained that dogs have more Cb1 receptors in their brains than people do. How that could make them more susceptible to toxic effects from THC. Who knows what intricate differences there are in other organisms? But let's talk about some similarities. Like the ECS in humans, omega-3 fatty acids are also super important for the ECS in dogs, and likely other animals too.
Yes, the foods that are critical are going to be omega-3s. And so omega-3 fatty acids are needed by the body in order to produce its own endocannabinoids. And so having polyunsaturated fatty acids is really critical. The challenge comes when the diets that we currently feed our pets are very high in omega-6s. So we really are lacking that omega-3. So that in many ways hinders the ability of those cannabinoids to do their job, to help support the endocannabinoid system. And so we really have to be aware of the fact that because of this great imbalance in the diets our pets are eating, that we really have to focus on supplementing and increasing the amount of omega-3s in their diet so that their body can better utilize these really important ingredients.
And it's really all about balance in the body. Isn't that kind of the whole basis behind the endocannabinoid system is if that's in balance in the body, then hopefully many other components of the body are going to be working well?
Absolutely, and that's one of the main functions of the endocannabinoid system is homeostasis. So you want to bring that body back into balance, and in order for it to do its job well, it has to have all of the precursors that it needs to perform that function. So the challenge is that if that endocannabinoid system is out of balance, then that's what sets up the body for disease processes. So you will see much more disease in animals who don't have the ability to bring everything back into balance. So yes, balance is a key word, and making sure that you have sufficient omega-3s is going to be really critical so that the system can do its job.
It seems that Slavko and Dr. Dodson agree on the importance of the concept of balance when talking about the ECS, whether for animals or for humans.
Agreed. We talked with Slavko about the ECS being a system of homeostasis, a system that relies on balance to function properly. And when it functions properly, it helps the body's physiology as a whole keep its balance. So as a veterinarian for over 20 years, Dr. Dodson has had a lot of experience using hemp to support the ECS in her pet patients. I asked her about the most common conditions in pets where she recommends using hemp. This is what she had to say.
Well, there's actually a very wide range of conditions. Research is being done currently for the use of supporting the endocannabinoid system by using hemp oil products in epilepsy, dogs who have epilepsy, in dogs who have osteoarthritis, in cats who have feline lower urinary tract disease, in cases of anxiety. And because the endocannabinoid system encompasses the entire body and all of the organ systems, there really is probably sky's the limit for potentially what we may discover as we do more research into what we can see benefits from. But for myself personally, I find that it really helps decrease inflammation of osteoarthritis, and that's part of the whole piece of the puzzle where the omega-3s come in to help decrease that inflammation that we have.
We've talked a lot about hemp in dogs, which is great, but what about cats? Do you recommend hemp for cats as much as you use it in dogs?
It's a little bit of a challenge in cats because cats are cats, and sometimes it's a flavor thing. So if you can get a cat to take it, I have found some great response. They seem to respond just as well, if not better, in a cat who's willing to take it. So that's probably the number one challenge, is getting them to take it. But there's also studies done in horses and monkeys, and so you can almost use it in any species. And as long as their body is at sufficient levels of omegas to support that process, you can expect to see some good results.
I had to chuckle when she said cats are cats, because that's totally true. As a pet owner, I know that if the stress of forcing a nutritional supplement on your pet causes more distress for both you and the pet, sometimes that might lead you to look for a different solution. I'm lucky that my dog eats his hemp supplements right up. I just drop it in his food bowl at breakfast and dinner.
You're so correct. And I'm really lucky too. I have 2 labs that will eat absolutely anything. So adding the hemp to their meals is super stress-free. But cats and dogs don't always follow the rules. And sometimes it can be tricky to get them to take supplements. It's important that pet owners be persistent with getting their pets to take the supplements if it was recommended by their veterinarian. So often, pet parents view supplements as optional and not as necessary as pharmaceuticals, and that isn't the case. There are lots of tricks that have been learned over the years to get cats and dogs to take supplements. It's just a matter of trying different things and remembering the importance of getting the supplement into the animals. This will help the pet parent have the conviction to find a way to get their pet to take the supplement. I know there's limited research on hemp, the endocannabinoid system in animals, but next I asked Dr. Dodson to tell me about some of the research that has been done on hemp and dogs.
Well, there are so many studies currently, and the good news is that some of the universities are starting to step up and do these studies. So the University of Florida has a couple of studies under their belt. There's Colorado has a couple of studies. There are a number of studies across the country that are in the process of exploring these, and hopefully more studies in the future that will better understand the link between levels of polyunsaturated fatty acids in the body and how efficient the endocannabinoid system can work.
And I think that the more we learn about the ECS and the benefits of hemp, there will be more and more studies done to support the safe use of this ingredient. The big reason we know so little is because historically there's been very little or more likely no education in the veterinary academic system on the endocannabinoid system. I know I didn't learn anything about the ECS when I was in tech school 20 years ago. So do you think veterinary schools will eventually add this type of education on the ECS to their curriculum?
Well, the challenge is that the endocannabinoid system was discovered about 28 years ago, almost 30 years ago. And the problem is that because it entails using cannabinoids, that became the dirty word. And so it was kind of squelched. And so it wasn't taught in universities. It wasn't, research wasn't allowed because it was a forbidden product when they looked at marijuana. So they totally ignored the whole hemp as a really viable component, very, very much so than marijuana. It provides a lot of phytocannabinoids. So as far as moving forward, hopefully now with some of the legalization of hemp in the country, it allows that research to move forward. So now that universities are stepping up with doing some research projects, I would hope and anticipate that they're joining the bandwagon, so to speak, so that they will start to educate students. And I think the real crime is that medical professionals have not been allowed to understand or know that this system even exists. And the power of the endocannabinoid system is kind of an untapped resource at this point. There's so much potential that we don't know, and as long as we can get research to move forward and start to talk about it in an open way without the politics of it being this is marijuana, because the biggest challenge is knowing the difference. And this is not marijuana, this is hemp, and they are 2 different plants, and they provide 2 different types of components. And so I think the potential and the opportunities are there, and I'm hoping that in 5 years or so that future veterinary students will be taught about this system.
I can imagine that it would be difficult to study something with such a confusing legal cloud over it. I assume the feasibility of studying cannabis and hemp with animals in schools also varies across different states in our country, as there are many different state regulations around cannabis use and possession.
On that note, let's hear what Dr. Dodson had to say about hemp legality. I'm wondering, as many vets might be, is it legal to recommend hemp for my patients?
Hemp became a legal agricultural product with the passing of the Farm Bill at the end of 2018. So that means by law, hemp is legal. It is now taken out from under control by the DEA. It is no longer considered a controlled substance. So it is now a legal product to be grown and a legal product to be harvested and used in products. The challenge is that there's still a lot of confusion about the legality of marijuana versus the legality of hemp. And so the confusion is all the way from the very top all the way down to the bottom. So people interchange the two terminologies, and that's the challenge because marijuana is not hemp, and they are legally definably separate. And until we can get legislators and regulators and people to understand that you cannot interchange the terminology, it's a little bit of a challenge state by state to know if it is considered legal or not, because some states still use hemp as a synonym for marijuana. So that's the challenge, is we need to get the regulators educated so that they know the difference, and then start there so that people then can understand there is a difference.
And that can vary from state to state, right?
Absolutely, and that's the challenge, because some states are starting to be a little more progressive, and some states are way behind and still consider hemp to be illegal. So it takes a long time for that to go through legislation, unfortunately. But once we can get through that process, but to me, I think it really needs education. We have to make sure that the lawmakers, the regulators, and the state licensing boards understand what it is they're dealing with. And until they understand the differences between those two, it's going to be a struggle to get them to regulate this in a way that's appropriate.
In your practice, how often do you have the pet owner asking for it before you even have a chance to recommend it?
Well, and I think that's a good point, because we as veterinary professionals are behind the curve if we do not step up and be the authorities for our clients and our patients. And because the hemp industry is the wild, wild west, if you go online, anybody can buy any CBD or hemp oil product that's on the market without any advice or recommendation. And because currently it's not a regulated supplement, there is a wide range of content and of label accuracy. There's no one to oversee that. So we as veterinarians need to be the ones to educate our clients. We need to be the ones to recommend a good quality product. And if we don't do that, they're going to get it on their own. And I will say that it's probably not a day goes by that I don't have a client that comes in my door and says, "Oh, my vet says they can't talk about hemp oil. What do you think?" And I'm happy to give them guidance. Or they will come in and I will make a recommendation that perhaps maybe we should consider using hemp in your pet. And they'll say, "Oh, I already get it online." And so that's so common. Most veterinarians have no idea that I would guess half of the patients they see are actually taking an over-the-counter online hemp oil product, and they're missing the boat by not being the ones to guide them in their choices, educate them on the quality or lack of quality of all of the products out there. So I think we as responsible medical professionals should be the ones who have that conversation, not be the ones who come in at the end of the game.
I'm glad that there are vets out there like Dr. Dodson who are helping well-intentioned pet owners navigate the wild, wild west of the hemp industry, as she puts it.
I totally agree. The more we learn about the potential benefits of this very complicated plant, the more we can confidently add it to our toolbox of tools that we can use to support our patients and help them to experience the best quality of life possible. I'm so glad we had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Dodson and learn more about the endocannabinoid system and the use of hemp from a veterinary perspective.
Definitely. And I'll just add that for anyone who's interested in learning more about the legality of cannabis and marijuana and hemp, and also about the 2018 Farm Bill and what those changes mean, we've got those resources on WholisticMatters.com.